Across the last 150 years, whenever a superpower's debt becomes unpayable, it reaches for the same move. Not a dramatic default, not a headline you see scrolling under a stock chart. Something quieter, cleaner, almost polite. They reset. And you care because resets don't fall out of the sky. They don't start with sirens. They start with a slow, invisible transfer. One you feel when the same grocery basket costs a little more, when your savings earn a little less, when wages lag just enough that you can't quite name what's happening. But you feel it anyway. Let me say it in the only way that matters. The reset doesn't start with a crash you see on TV. It starts with a quiet transfer you feel in your life. And by the time it reaches the TV, you're already paying for it. This isn't a conspiracy, it's gravity. It's what happens when a government owes more than it can ever realistically repay, and every honest exit is a political death sentence. Leaders don't volunteer for pain early. They don't walk into elections carrying austerity in their teeth. They wait, they stall, they rename the problem. And when the numbers finally corner them, they do what trapped powers have always done. They change the rules and call it rescue. A sovereign reset is what happens when the three obvious doors are shut. Door one is the fairy tale. Grow out of it. The economy expands so fast that the debt shrinks relative to income. It can happen. But when debt is already high, demographics are aging, and interest costs start eating the budget from the inside, that door doesn't open. It gets nailed shut. Door two is honesty, default, or openly restructure. That's political suicide. It's the kind of truth that ends a presidency faster than any scandal. So there's door three, the door almost nobody names out loud. You reduce the debt without admitting you reduced it. You preserve legitimacy. You shift the loss. You do it legally, deniably, and slowly enough that half the country argues about whether it's happening while the other half absorbs it. That third door is the reset. Think of a household that's trapped. If you owe a mountain of money you can't pay, you can win the lottery, declare bankruptcy, or quietly change the terms. You refinance. You stretch the payments. You let inflation shrink the real value. You make your bank accept a deal without ever using the word loss. You still pay, but in cheaper dollars, over longer time, at rates that don't reflect risk. Sovereigns do the same thing, just with cleaner suits and bigger language. And once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Start with the United States in 1933. Not the America in your head, highways, suburbs, a booming middle class, but a country with banks collapsing in real time. Lines outside locked doors, people pounding on windows, 40% of banks gone. The economy shrank so fast that debt wasn't just heavy, it was lethal. And here's the part that should make you sit up. The national debt back then wasn't huge by modern standards, around 45% of GDP, but deflation turned every dollar owed into a tightening vice. The burden was growing even as the economy died. Washington did something that, if you're honest, was a reset in everything but name. First, they shut the gold window. Then they banned Americans from holding monetary gold. Then they gathered it. Then they quietly changed the price of gold from about $20 an ounce to $35. A massive devaluation of the dollar against gold, almost 70%, and a silent haircut on every debt contract tied to the old rules. They didn't stand at a podium and say, "We're defaulting." They said emergency. They said stability. They said temporary. The effect wasn't temporary. Debt got lighter in real terms. The system survived. Creditors were paid back in cheaper dollars. Debtors found oxygen. Prices reflated. Real interest rates stayed negative for years. A country was saved by moving the loss into a place most people couldn't see. Then, 1971. Different decade, different suits, same gravity. America had become the engine of the world, and the world was holding dollars like tickets to a gold-backed promise. But the promise was cracking. Foreign central banks were demanding gold. U.S. reserves were draining. And then, on live television, Nixon did the thing leaders do when arithmetic corners them. He changed the rules and called it protection. He closed the gold window. No more redemption. The dollar slid 20-something% against major currencies. Gold ripped higher. And the U.S. inflated down its obligations without ever using the word default. Again, the reset arrived in a sentence, then unfolded over years. Quiet on day one, expensive forever. One more scene, because this one is the blueprint modern governments pray you never learn. Post-World War II, Britain was over 200% debt to GDP, the US above 100. Everyone exhausted, everyone broke. Nobody willing to tell voters, we're ripping up the bonds we sold you to win the war. So they didn't. They did something cleaner. Interest rates were capped low. Banks and pensions were nudged, then forced, into holding government bonds. Capital controls stood guard like fences around a field. Inflation was allowed to run just high enough to chew on the debt year after year. Real yields went negative for a decade. And debt that looked unmovable in 1945 quietly melted by the early 1960s without a single dramatic default speech. 3 eras, 3 costumes, same play. Once you line these episodes up, something colder than history repeats. You start to feel rhythm beneath the facts, a sequence, a set of beats that arrives whether anyone votes for it or not. First beat is denial. Picture politicians on campaign stages doing victory laps, cutting ribbons, promising prosperity, while the debt line on a quiet spreadsheet drifts past 90, 100, 110% of GDP. Nobody calls it a crisis. Markets are calm. Asset prices are up. The mood is, we can handle it. Second beat is the twitch. Not a collapse, a flinch, a bond auction tails. Buyers demand higher yield than expected. The word unsustainable starts showing up in serious places. Ratings agencies clear their throats. Central banks talk less about growth and more about stability. The plumbing people notice first. Everyone else keeps scrolling. The third beat is permission, a special commission, a framework, an emergency tool. It's the stage where the government doesn't say reset, but it quietly builds the legal and institutional cover to do reset things. The language shifts first. Policy follows behind it like a shadow. Fourth beat is adjustment. The rules change in front of your face, but with soft edges. QE becomes liquidity. Yield caps become market functioning. Capital controls become anti-speculation. Inflation is transitory until it becomes policy. The currency slips, or wages do. Real debt shrinks. Savers feel the blade. Not all at once, but enough to change behavior. Fifth beat is forgetting. A new bull market arrives. A new normal gets announced. Politicians rebrand survival as recovery. Media runs victory headlines. People rebuild lives inside a new price level and call it progress. Because humans need closure, they tell themselves it was random, not a pattern, not a transfer, not a choice. 5 beats, same order, different countries. If that feels abstract, watch it in a life. In 1933, the gold standard wasn't an academic policy. It was a promise. Your dollar could be turned into a fixed amount of gold anytime. By the early 1930s, that promise had become a death pact. Deflation was rising. Every year you owed more in real terms. Farmers were drowning, businesses were failing, banks freezing. The government needed to grow the money supply to stop the spiral, but gold said no. You can't print beyond your gold. So the reset began as a survival maneuver. Gold convertibility was suspended. Gold clauses in debt contracts suddenly meant nothing. Then gold was repriced upward, making every dollar worth less gold overnight. Brilliant, brutal, politically survivable. The hidden incentive is simple. When a government is trapped, it wants inflation without confessing it wants inflation. So it finds a mask. The mask changes. The incentive doesn't. Sometimes adjustment isn't even a choice. Sometimes markets drag you into it. Britain in 1931 had World War I debt like a stone necklace, around 140% of GDP. The pound was locked to gold at a pre-war parity that made British exports uncompetitive. Unemployment was north of 20%. Reserves were bleeding. Markets smelled the weakness. A speculative attack hit. Britain tried to defend the peg and failed. In September 1931, it suspended gold redemption. Sterling dropped about 23%, trade-weighted almost instantly, around 30% versus the dollar. That wasn't just panic. It was reset machinery. Competitiveness returned. Exports recovered. Growth came back by 1933. Debt eased downward. When the cage breaks, the currency takes the hit first, always. Now look at the violent version, because it shows you what happens when the debt isn't in your own currency. Argentina, 2001. The peso had been pegged 1-to-1 to the US dollar for a decade. Early on, it felt like salvation. Inflation fell, confidence rose, growth arrived. Then competitiveness died, capital fled, debt swelled toward 130% of GDP. But Argentina couldn't print dollars. It was trapped in an external currency cage. So when the math snapped, the reset went loud. The peg was abandoned. The peso devalued about 71%. 1 to 1 became 3.5 to 1. The government defaulted on $82 billion of debt. Bondholders took haircuts up to 75%. GDP fell 11% in 2002. Poverty hit 54%. Real wages collapsed 30 to 40%. Then, as resets often do, growth returned hard. By 2008, debt to GDP was back down around 50%. The losses were real. The survival was real too. That's what external currency resets look like. Fast, ugly, and unforgettable. Different costumes, same gravity. Now pin the present, because this is where the story stops being history and becomes you. U.S. debt to GDP is around 123% in 2024 and projected higher into the 2030s. Net interest cost for fiscal year 2024 was about $881 billion, approaching defense budget scale. Projected interest costs rise faster than revenues, toward $1.8 trillion a year by the mid-2030s if current trajectories hold. Primary deficits, deficits before interest, are running 4 to 5% of GDP with no credible political path to surplus. Cutting spending at scale is politically impossible. Hiking taxes at scale is politically impossible. The easy doors are closed. Here's what that means in real life. Imagine a household where the interest on the credit card is so big it's starting to crowd out groceries and rent. Not next year, now. The bill grows every month, even if you stop buying anything new. You don't fix that with a pep talk about responsibility. You fix it by changing the terms, or you get wiped out. That's the position the U.S. is walking into in slow motion. And you can see the twitch if you look where cameras don't. A treasury auction on a random Tuesday tails. Buyers demand a higher yield than the market expected. It doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't interrupt your Netflix. But in the plumbing rooms, the guys who keep the global machine running start trading a different way. They smell that the price of safety is starting to rise. Quietly, first in basis points, then in headlines. So where are we in the arc? We are beyond denial, past the early twitch. We are in permission, where policy and language evolve toward reset tools with a smile. You can hear it in the words. Stabilization, replacing repayment. Debt ceiling theater so constant it functions like a recurring mini-default scare. Warnings that don't just whisper unsustainable, they formalize it. You can see it in habits that were supposed to be temporary. Balance sheet expansions that never fully unwind. Markets that assume rate suppression will eventually return. The normalization of negative real yields. Inflation tolerated a bit hot, as if that's a preference instead of a necessity. Then there's the backdrop shifting outside America's control. Global central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold in 2024, near the highest totals in modern records. The buyers aren't Western allies. They're the BRICS bloc and non-aligned states. They say it plainly. Reduce dollar dependence, hedge sanctions risk. Parallel plumbing is forming alongside the dollar system, CBDCs, digital settlement rails. China's ECNY is active. Brazil's DREX is in pilots. The digital euro inches forward. The US is still allergic to a retail CBDC for now. None of this causes an American reset by itself. It doesn't have to. It changes the margins. And when you're already trapped, margins become destiny. Dollar reserve share has drifted down from about 70% in the mid-1980s to around 60% in the mid-2020s. If that erosion keeps going, even slowly, trillions in reserve reallocations push U.S. funding costs upward. Not a sudden apocalypse, a tightening vice, the kind that doesn't scream until your bones crack. What pushes a trapped state from permission into full adjustment? Historically, it's one or two sparks at the wrong moment. A recession that spikes deficits just as revenues fall. A bond market revolt where yields rise faster than suppression can hold. A reserve demand shock where de-dollarization accelerates. Or political paralysis that triggers a technical default scare and breaks trust. You don't need all four. You need one. And history has never had a shortage of wrong moments. If this were a movie, we're past the setup. We're in the chapter where rules start changing. Growth can solve it, people say. Sure, if the US gets a productivity miracle, debt to GDP can fall. But after World War II, the decline wasn't growth alone. It was growth plus repression plus inflation. Real yields were negative for a decade. Demographics were a tailwind. Today, they're a headwind. Baseline projections assume steady 2% growth with no recessions. That's not a plan. That's a prayer. The US can't default. The Fed can print. True. Nominal default on dollar debt is unnecessary. But printing to avoid default is just adjustment with a nicer word. The fourth beat in a different mask. Bondholders and savers still lose in real terms through inflation and negative yields. Foreign holders lose twice, currency loss plus inflation loss. Can print doesn't eliminate resets. It tells you how they happened. The dollar is permanent. Reserve currencies don't disappear overnight. They rot slowly. The pound didn't die in a weekend. It eroded through a century. Permanence is a bedtime story humans tell themselves because the alternative hurts. Markets don't respect bedtime stories. So what do you do with this? Not because it's fun, because it's survival against an incentive machine that doesn't care about you. First, know what you're holding. If most of your net worth sits in long-dated nominal promises, cash, low-yield savings, long bonds, you're standing exactly where resets land. That is the sponge. Second, watch for captivity. Resets need captive lenders. If your default financial life locks you into yields below inflation, you're financing the adjustment whether you consent or not. Third, favor pricing power over promises. Assets or businesses that can raise prices with inflation survive adjustment better than fixed coupons that quietly bleed. Fourth, diversify currency exposure prudently, not as a fantasy about fleeing your country, but as a hedge against a single currency path. Resets are currency events before they're anything else. Fifth, shorten duration risk and stay liquid enough to exploit volatility. Long fixed-rate promises are the easiest targets. Liquidity is the only weapon ordinary people get handed in the permission phase. Sixth, reduce high-interest personal debt. Sovereign resets come with regime shifts and rates before repression locks them down. Don't be fragile right before the weather turns. Seventh, keep your income adaptive. Wages lag, jobs lag. The more negotiation power and flexibility you have, the less the reset writes your life for you. That's not optimism. That's triage. Bring it home. 3 times it happened before in superpowers and in smaller countries your teachers skipped. When sovereign debt becomes unpayable, governments reset it through the same gravitational arc. Denial, twitch, permission, adjustment, forgetting. Different flags, same mechanism. We're not guaranteed to hit every beat on a tidy schedule. History isn't that polite, but the direction is clear because the incentives are clear and the arithmetic is merciless. If you don't know the pattern, you play the citizen role in someone else's reset. If you do know it, you manage risk like history expects you to. Timeline unknowable, mechanism inevitable. Watch the beats, watch the language, watch the temporary measures. That's where resets live. And that's where they take from you, quietly, legally. History doesn't repeat. It rhymes with incentives. If you don't understand the pattern, you become the collateral. If you do, you survive it. Before you go, tell me something real. Where do you feel the reset in your own life? Is it groceries creeping up, rent jumping, wages that never catch the prices, or a savings account that looks like someone turned it into a slow drip? Put it in the comments. Not to complain, so everyone can see the transfer happening in the open. Subscribe so you don't miss the next beat.